The infrared feed showed nothing but static and heat signatures dissolving into the Hindu Kush darkness. 23 Navy SEALs pinned against a granite cliff face, ammunition counters blinking red across every weapon system, and the voice on the radio had gone silent 40 seconds ago. The AC-130 gunship that was supposed to provide cover had taken an RPG through its starboard engine and limped back to Bagram with half its hydraulics bleeding into the night sky. The quick reaction force was grounded by a dust storm that turned the Kandahar basin into an ocean of brown chaos. The Taliban fighters knew exactly what they had: America's finest trapped in a kill box with nowhere to run and no angels left in the sky. Master Chief Garrett Voss pressed his throat mic and whispered the words nobody wanted to say. Avalanche 1 to any station. We are Winchester on everything but sidearms, multiple wounded. Request immediate CAS, over. The response crackled back with the kind of hesitation that meant bad news wrapped in procedure. Avalanche 1. Be advised all fast movers are bingo fuel or tasked elsewhere. Working your request. Stand by. Stand by. The phrase that meant start writing letters home in your head. Voss looked at his senior enlisted advisor, a gunner's mate from Corpus Christi who'd been killing bad guys since before some of these Taliban fighters were born, and saw his own thoughts reflected there. They'd run every play in the book, and the book was out of pages. Then the radio frequency shifted. A different voice, calm as Sunday morning coffee, with an accent that suggested Oklahoma or maybe Kansas, somewhere flat where people still said ma'am without irony. Avalanche 1, Hog 27, I copy your traffic. Inbound your position. 3 minutes. Authenticate Bravo Delta 7 Niner. Voss felt his spine straighten involuntarily. Warthog. The ugly angel nobody wanted at the dance until the shooting started. But 3 minutes was a lifetime when machine gun fire was walking closer every second. Hog 27, authenticate Delta 622, be advised we are danger close. Friendlies marked with infrared strobes. Enemy 50 meters northwest our position and closing. The voice came back without hesitation. Copy danger close, I see your strobes. Recommend you get small and stay small. This will be intimate. Something about that voice, steady as sunrise, made Voss believe. He'd heard 1,000 combat pilots on the radio, but this one carried weight different from confidence. This one sounded like someone who'd already decided the outcome and was just waiting for reality to catch up. Lieutenant Commander Renee Cahill had already pushed her Thunderbolt through, whether that would have turned back anything, with a sensible survival instinct. The turbulence over the mountains felt like flying through a rock tumbler, her instruments flickering as electrical storms played hell with her avionics. But the A-10 was built by people who assumed you'd be flying through the apocalypse anyway. She'd been returning from a strike mission in Helmand Province when she caught the emergency frequency. SEALs in trouble was the kind of call that made every other mission disappear. Her fuel gauge showed enough for maybe one gun run and a prayer to make it back to base. But fuel was just math, and math could be argued with later. She broke through the cloud deck at 8,000 feet and immediately spotted the infrared strobes forming a tight defensive perimeter against the mountainside. The Taliban positions lit up on her targeting pod like Christmas lights, muzzle flashes sparking in rough crescent formation as they pressed closer to the trapped Americans. Renee's hands moved through the weapons checklist with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in conditions ranging from perfect to catastrophic. GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannons spooled up with a sound like a sleeping giant clearing its throat, 30-millimeter rounds ready to write sentences that ended arguments permanently. Maverick missiles hung ready under her wings, but this geometry was too tight for standoff weapons. She'd have to get personal. Avalanche 1, Hog 27 commencing gun run from north to south. Track my tracers. Adjust fire on my mark. Renee rolled inverted and pulled the A-10's nose toward the earth, letting gravity and 700 hours of close air support experience guide her through the dive. The Warthog wasn't pretty, wasn't fast, but in this moment with American lives measured in heartbeats, it was exactly the right weapon delivered by exactly the right person. The SEAL Master Chief's voice came back clipped and professional. Hog 27, you are cleared hot. God bless the Air Force. Renee smiled inside her oxygen mask. Sir, Navy actually, but I'll take the blessing either way. She squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 roared to life, with a sound that physically changed the air pressure for a quarter-mile in every direction. The recoil slowed her airspeed by 40 knots as depleted uranium penetrators traveled downrange at nearly twice the speed of sound, each round carrying enough kinetic energy to core an engine block. The tracers looked like an angry red laser drawn from heaven straight into the Taliban fighting positions. Rock and dirt fountained skyward as the 30-millimeter rounds walked through enemy fighters who'd been so certain of their victory 30 seconds earlier. Renee held the trigger down for exactly 2.5 seconds. Any longer, and she'd risk the gun overheating. Any shorter and she wouldn't get full effect on target. She pulled out of the dive at 3,000 feet, her airframe groaning under 6 gs of stress as she climbed back toward attack altitude. The A-10 absorbed the punishment without complaint because titanium bathtubs wrapped around cockpits tended to be forgiving about the abuse. Behind her, the Taliban crescent had dissolved into chaos, survivors scrambling for whatever cover they could find. But Renee knew from experience that shock and awe lasted about 90 seconds before training and desperation reasserted themselves. Avalanche 1, give me battle damage assessment. Voss's voice came back with something that might have been hope sneaking past his tactical discipline. Hog 27, estimate 15 enemy KIA. Remaining forces withdrawing to cave systems northwest. We have breathing room, but we're not out yet. Renee checked her fuel gauge and ran calculations that required optimism and luck in equal measure. One more pass, maybe two, if she accepted that walking home from a crash site built character. The A-10's right engine was running hot, not critical yet but trending that direction. Probably picked up small arms damage during her gun run that hadn't registered as significant enough to warrant a warning light. She could RTB right now, declare emergency fuel, let someone else finish this fight. That was the reasonable choice, the one that made sense to anyone who wanted to see their next birthday. But 23 SEALs were still trapped, and the Taliban weren't known for accepting defeat gracefully. Avalanche 1, Hog 27, I'm staying on station for follow-up strikes. Talk me onto any targets that need my attention. There was a pause before Voss responded, and when he did his voice carried a different quality, the kind of respect that combat professionals reserved for other combat professionals who just proven themselves under fire. Hog 27, you are danger close, Princess, right now. Fuel state has to be critical. Renee banked into position for another run, watching the Taliban survivors trying to regroup near a cluster of boulders that would provide excellent cover unless someone dropped ordnance directly on top of them. Avalanche 1, my fuel state is between me and gravity. Your life expectancy is my problem. Now light up those boulder positions with your laser designator. The Master Chief didn't argue, just painted the target with the kind of precision that came from knowing your friendly neighborhood A-10 pilot was about to put high explosives uncomfortably close to your position. Renee selected a Maverick missile, locked onto the laser designation, and let the weapon fly. The AGM-65 Maverick streaked downward with the single-minded determination of a bullet that had its own guidance system and a personal grudge. The explosion turned the boulder cluster into gravel and sent a shockwave rippling across the mountainside that probably registered on seismographs in Islamabad. Secondary explosions suggested the Taliban had been storing ammunition in those caves, which was bad luck for them and excellent luck for everyone else. Renee's right engine temperature gauge climbed into the yellow zone, then kissed the red line with the kind of insistence that suggested mechanical components were having philosophical disagreements about continuing to function. Her fuel gauge showed 15 minutes of flying time if nothing else went wrong, which in combat aviation terms meant about 7 minutes before something definitely went wrong. She could see the SEAL position clearly now, tight defensive formation, starting to relax slightly as the immediate threat dissolved. Movement at the perimeter caught her attention. Two MH-47 Chinook helicopters appearing from the south, heavy cavalry, arriving fashionably late, but arriving nonetheless. The quick reaction force had punched through the dust storm. Hog 27 Avalanche 1. We have rotary wing inbound for extract. You are hereby released, and ma'am, you just saved 23 lives. Renee acknowledged with a simple Roger, then turned her wounded A-10 toward Bagram, nursing the throttles to keep both engines running. The right engine finally made its displeasure known with a compressor stall that sounded like someone dropping a toolbox down a metal staircase. She feathered the throttle and the engine caught again, running rough but running. Single-engine flight in an A-10 wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. The aircraft had been designed assuming half of it would be shot off in combat anyway. She settled into the long limp home, watching the fuel gauge count down while the Hindu Kush peaks passed beneath her wings like stone giants indifferent to human drama. The landing at Bagram was textbook perfect despite the failing engine and fumes in her tanks. Renee taxied to the Diarm area where maintenance crews were already waiting, their faces showing the kind of concern that came from seeing an A-10 trailing smoke from one engine with battle damage stitched across the fuselage. She shut down both engines, popped the canopy, and climbed out to inspect the damage. 14 small arms impacts across her starboard side, 3 of them through areas that would have been catastrophic on any other aircraft, but merely annoying on the titanium-armored Warthog. The crew chief, a technical sergeant from Montana who'd seen his share of shot-up aircraft, whistled appreciatively. "Ma'am, you flew this bird home on determination and spite." The debrief took 3 hours, walking through every second of the engagement with intelligence officers who wanted to know exactly how many enemy fighters, exactly what weapons, exactly what munitions expended. Renee answered their questions with professional precision, while her mind kept replaying that moment when she'd committed to staying on station despite everything screaming to RTB. Later, the wing commander would call it heroic. The maintenance officer would call it insane. Renee would call it Tuesday, because this was her 4th close air support mission that week, and the war had a way of making the exceptional feel routine. She filed her paperwork, debriefed with her squadron mates, and tried to sleep while her brain kept running calculations about fuel states and firing solutions. 3 days later, Master Chief Garrett Voss appeared at her squadron building, still wearing field gear that looked like it had been through a wood chipper. He asked for Lieutenant Commander Cahill specifically, and when Renee walked into the ready room, she found herself facing a man who'd seen every flavor of combat and decided he needed to say something in person. "Ma'am, my team wanted me to deliver a message personally. You gave us our lives back when everyone else gave up. Half my guys are going home to their families because you decided fuel gauges were suggestions rather than limitations." Renee felt her throat tighten slightly because praise from SEALs wasn't something distributed casually. "Master Chief, I was just doing my job." Voss smiled the smile of someone who'd been in enough firefights to know the difference between doing your job and doing something that required a different kind of courage. Ma'am, everyone does their job. You did something extra. My guys are calling you Cahill the Unmerciful because of how you handled those Taliban fighters. But I've been around long enough to know mercy comes in different forms. Staying on station with a dying engine and no fuel when you could have justified leaving was mercy toward us, just not toward them. He extended his hand and Rene shook it, feeling the calluses of someone who'd spent decades pulling triggers and saving lives in equal measure. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you've got 23 guys who will move heaven and earth. After he left, Rene's squadron commander called her into his office. Colonel Hernandez had flown F-16s in Desert Storm and new combat aviation from both sides of the speed spectrum. Cahill, that SEAL Master Chief, also stopped by my office before finding you. He told me what you did out there, and I want you to know I'm putting you in for a distinguished flying cross. Flying into that weather, staying on station with critical fuel single-engine recovery, that's the kind of flying that reminds people why we do this job. Rene nodded her thanks, but something in her expression made the colonel pause. You thinking about those Taliban fighters you killed? Rene considered lying, but decided honesty served better. Sir, I'm thinking about the 23 Americans I didn't lose. The Taliban made their choice when they ambushed that patrol. Hernandez studied her for a moment before speaking again. You know what separates good pilots from great pilots? Good pilots never make mistakes. Great pilots make all the right mistakes and survive them anyway. You pushed that past every reasonable limit because the alternative was unacceptable. That's judgment, and judgment can't be taught. Rene left his office feeling something complex that wasn't quite pride but was related to it. The satisfaction of knowing she'd been tested under conditions designed to break people, and had come through intact. She walked across the flight line, where her A-10 sat surrounded by maintenance crews performing what amounted to an engine transplant and structural repairs. The aircraft looked like it had fought a war all by itself, which wasn't far from the truth. The story spread through the base with the velocity that military rumors achieved when they were actually true. The Navy pilot who flew Air Force A-10s and saved a SEAL team with engines failing and fuel tanks showing empty. Details got embellished in the retelling. Some versions had her taking ground fire from multiple directions. Others had her engine actually on fire during the engagement. Rene ignored the mythology building around her and focused on preparing for the next mission, because the war hadn't stopped just because she'd had one memorable night. But something had shifted in how other pilots looked at her. A subtle acknowledgement that she joined a specific club whose membership required doing something extraordinary under impossible conditions. 6 weeks later, the citation for her Distinguished Flying Cross came through, formal language that tried to capture adrenaline and fear and determination in bureaucratic prose. The ceremony was attended by half the wing and a delegation of SEALs who traveled from their base specifically to watch her receive the medal. Master Chief Voss stood in the front row wearing dress whites that looked uncomfortable on someone built for combat gear. When the wing commander pinned the medal to her uniform, Voss started the applause that turned into a standing ovation. Renee felt heat rise in her cheeks because public recognition always felt more awkward than the actual flying. But she maintained military bearing and accepted the honor with appropriate humility. Afterward, at the informal gathering in the officers' club, one of the younger SEALs approached her with the kind of nervousness that suggested he was about to ask an important question. "Ma'am, can I ask what was going through your head when you decided to stay on station? Everyone says you knew you were flying on fumes." Renee considered her answer carefully because flippant responses diminished what had actually happened. "I was thinking about math and acceptable outcomes." The math said I probably couldn't make it back. The acceptable outcomes said leaving you guys to die definitely wasn't an option. So the math had to be wrong, and I'd figure out why after everyone was safe. The SEAL, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at her with something approaching reverence. "That's the most operator mindset thing I've ever heard an aviator say, ma'am." Renee laughed because the line between different military specialties dissolved pretty quickly when people were actively trying to kill you. "We all wear the same flag on our shoulders. The service branch on our uniforms just describes our tactical approach to the same mission." She spent the next hour talking with SEALs and pilots, swapping stories and building the kind of bonds that came from shared understanding of what it meant to volunteer for the dangerous stuff. But later that night, alone in her quarters, Renee allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened. She'd made a decision that could have killed her, based on calculations that balanced her life against 23 others, and luck had been kind enough to let everyone make it home. Combat aviation required a specific kind of mental calculus, where you assessed acceptable risk constantly and made choices that would be second-guessed later by people who weren't there. She thought about the Taliban fighters she'd killed, young men who'd made their own choices and paid with their lives. The moral arithmetic of war was ugly but unavoidable. Sometimes protecting the good guys meant destroying the bad guys with extreme prejudice, and regret was a luxury reserved for people who'd never had to make those choices under fire. The Hindu Kush Mountains looked the same the next time she flew over them, indifferent stone giants that had watched armies come and go for thousands of years. Renee's A-10 had been repaired and returned to service, fresh engines and patched fuselage ready for the next crisis. She flew her missions with the same professional competence that had always defined her flying, But now other pilots treated her differently, not with awe exactly, but with the recognition that she'd proven herself in the specific ways that mattered in combat aviation. The SEALs she'd saved sent care packages to her squadron, inside jokes and gratitude wrapped in military humor that acknowledged shared experience without drowning in sentiment. Master Chief Voss stayed in touch through irregular emails that arrived whenever he had reliable internet access in whatever corner of the world his team was currently operating. His messages were brief and practical, updates on his team members who wanted her to know they were thriving, occasional questions about aviation, because he was genuinely curious how the flying part worked. Rene appreciated his straightforward approach. No melodrama, no excessive gratitude, just professional respect between people who'd shared something significant. When she eventually rotated back to the States, Voss and several team members showed up at her change of command ceremony, a gesture that spoke volumes about the bonds formed under fire. Years later, after she'd made commander and then captain, after she'd transitioned to training the next generation of A-10 pilots, Rene would tell her students about that night in the Hindu Kush. She'd walk them through the decision tree, the fuel calculations, the risk assessment, and then she'd pause before delivering the lesson that couldn't be found in any training manual. Aviation is physics and procedures until someone's life depends on you making it work when physics says no. That's when you discover what kind of pilot you actually are. The kind who follows the book even when the book gets people killed, or the kind who rewrites the book and deals with the consequences later. Choose wisely, because that choice defines everything that comes after. The story of Lieutenant Commander Rene Cahill and the SEALs she saved on a mountain in Afghanistan became one of those legends that circulated through military aviation communities. Details varied depending on who told it, but the core remained constant. A pilot who refused to accept an unacceptable outcome, an aircraft designed to absorb punishment, and 23 warriors who got to go home because someone decided their lives were worth risking everything. The Hindu Kush Mountains kept their secrets and their scars, another chapter written in stone and blood, another reminder that sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph came down to one person refusing to quit when quitting made perfect sense.